Aligning himself. There we go. He's aligning himself further with Russia, distancing Hungary from the EU. He stood in the way of the EU's allocation of economic funds for Hungary, stood in the way of the EU's allocation of military funds to Ukraine. Notwithstanding all of that, as a way of describing realpolitik, I guess the best way to say it is that one man's devil is another man's friend, or he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. He has been very, very good for Israel. He has a close relationship with Netanyahu. He has withdrawn from the Rome Statute and the ICC in defense of Israel. So he has been good for Israel, notwithstanding all the reasons why he is now out of office. So what does it mean for ELNET? Well, on a couple of levels, we don't expect much to change between Hungary, that is Peter Magyar's positions towards Israel. We expect them to have strong relations. He is likely to concede on a couple of EU decisions in an effort to, let's say, go along to get along. Hungary has stood against a number of EU resolutions and positions with regard to Israel. He may find himself conceding on those points. But the stakes for Hungary are pretty high. It means that they will get billions of dollars of economic relief. And it also means that Ukraine is likely to receive 90 billion towards their military efforts. What this directly means for ELNET is that we can start working out in the open in Hungary. It was difficult for us to do so before because of the relationships between EU countries and Hungary. We had to do things behind the scenes with Hungary likely aligning itself with EU nations on a positive way. We're able to do these things more overtly, more constructively, including Hungary and delegations, working with them on strategic dialogues. So the opportunity for ELNET to expand its operations in Central and Eastern Europe under Marta Kubica's leadership is a positive turn of events. So I wanted to bring everybody up to speed on that. And I think let's all look forward to the future, because I will tell you, and as all you know, things are changing faster than we can keep up with them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our discussion with Mike. You know, Mike, almost every briefing I hold, I'll spend the first week coming up with questions, kind of formulating where I want a conversation to go. I didn't do it last week. And I didn't do it because I knew whatever I was trying to ask would be old news by the time you showed up today. So I kind of know where I want to go, but I'm going to leave the conversation for you and me to be a little more fluid here. But I think the way to start is the 21-hour negotiation. If you look back to some of the reporting by, and I'll classify people into three groups. You have real experts, you have air quote experts, and you have those on X who pretend to be experts. And it's quite remarkable how many people knew for certain what Iran was up to, or knew for certain what the US was up to. And a few said, let's just wait and see what happens. How do you assess the 21-hour negotiation? I mean, even I, and I'm nobody, knew that Galibaf had no authority to negotiate. Yet Witkoff, Kushner, and Vance went to meet with Galibaf. At the 4-hour mark, I probably would have said to myself, I don't think this is going so well. At the 12-hour mark, I probably would have said, I'm out. But it lasted for 21, which leads me to believe, I want to ask, who's playing who here? So give us a sense of how you're looking at the 21-hour negotiation. What did it reveal to us? And were there other objectives that the administration was really trying to achieve here? Or was it simply, let's just negotiate and see what we can get out of this?
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I did spend 8 years in the intelligence community after the military as a subject matter expert on Iran, working directly for Generals Petraeus, Odierno, and McMaster, specifically focused on the IRGC playbook. The IRGC playbook in Iraq, in Syria, and how they played previous administrations. And when I left the IC, I went to the Hudson Institute. I also went to the the National Defense University to look at what Iran was doing with regards to exploiting the ISIS crisis. And in that, I testified before Congress on the JCPOA, the Iran deal, also the IRGC proxy networks that we're seeing at play here. So going into the 21-hour, you know, negotiations. I have not been a fan of Witkoff or Kushner negotiating outcomes, specifically working with Qatar when it comes to Gaza, working with Putin when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia war. I understand that they are trusted by President Trump, and I understood that they knew what his red lines were. And I think the regime was a little surprised. I think the regime thought they could outmaneuver this negotiating team because they'd already seen the Witkoff playbook. They know the Jared Kushner playbook. And the reason I say that is we have to remember that before February 28th, the regime, when it was still alive, before Operation Epic Fury and Roaring Lion took place, they believed that Qatar and Erdogan had the ear of the president and that they could get President Trump not to attack the regime based on all the investment that Qatar had put into the Trump organization, Trump Incorporated. We're talking about Witkoff, we're talking about Kushner, we're talking about Trump's sons. And I love that Trump took the money, meaning Trump Inc. took the money and then basically told Qatar to go pound sand. And what I mean by that is the regime was caught off guard on February 28th. So that regime was used to dealing with the Obama administration, with the Obama Biden administration, with the George Bush administration, after 9/11. And I think this regime had a lot of experience with Trump prior to February 28th, uh, in that he had taken out Qasem Soleimani in 2020. He had conducted the June operation, the 12-day war, which I criticized as a bumper sticker campaign because it didn't finish the job. And I didn't like that it was something being used by the administration to say, look what we did ahead of the midterms. Operation Epic Fury is different. This ceasefire was contingent on Iran opening up the Strait of Hormuz as a good faith gesture. And it turned into Iran making it a red line to be able to profit from taxing vessels that would come in and out. I was skeptical of the talks. I thought we were going to come away with a Trump strengthened JCPOA type deal where Iran receive sanctions relief for the promise of something. And we've seen what the regime does when it promises something, right? It delays, it increases provocations for further concessions. And I was worried about that until I saw that the US Navy was moving in at the same time these negotiations were going on, moving into the Strait of Hormuz. We have to pay attention to what CENTCOM does, not necessarily what the administration tweets out there and puts out there. And in hour 17, hour 15, actually, the US Navy starts deploying two missile cruise ships into the Strait of Hormuz, and the negotiations are ongoing. I believe the regime thought that they could buy time. I thought the regime thought that they could delay. And I think this is the first time the regime saw the US walk out of the door first. We have to remember in the past, Zarif would walk out the door and Kerry would chase him down the hallway and try to get him to come back in to negotiate. This is the first time this regime, this level of regime, the backup quarterback regime, has dealt with the U.S. walking out first. And in any negotiation, if you walk out first, you have the upper hand. And by the way, I do like the language coming out of the Trump administration that Iran has no cards. They have no cards in these negotiations. We still maintain a military presence, the military capability. Our rules of engagement, our ROE allow us to attack if any of our Navy ships are threatened by the remnants of the IRGC Navy. So I think it was a good thing. The ceasefire is still in place. It's still tentatively in place. We're waiting for more overreach by the regime, but the ceasefire will last as long as Trump puts up with violations of it.
It's interesting because each side has its protractors and retractors. The Iranians invented negotiate. They invented chess, and therefore the best negotiators. Trump is the mastermind. Iran is not as good as they claim to be. They get away with bluff. Trump is not nearly as cunning as he likes to put out that he is. Who here was playing for time in the most cunning way?
If we look at the most cunning way, I think it's the president of the United States because we're still deploying assets into the region. If you look at the airflow into U.S. basing in the Middle East the last 24 hours, it's a steady stream of support aircraft, military aircraft. So I think in that regard, it buys the U.S. time so that when there is a ceasefire violation or Trump decides to say, okay, it's April 22nd, nothing happened, the regime did not come back to the negotiating table. We are now going to do this. And now US forces are already in place. If it's the regime, I think it failed. The regime thought they were going to be able to buy time, thought they were going to be able to make these talks in Islamabad last for 3 or 4 days. And that didn't happen. And I commend the negotiating team for walking out because I think it sends a message to this regime that, especially with the deployment during the talks, that is a move that the regime did not anticipate. I just think it sends a message that they don't have any cards. We've seen the escalation rhetoric about closing down the Bab el-Mandeb or the Gulf of Aden, and also being able to, you know, threatening to attack U.S. Navy ships in the area, but we haven't seen a response yet. So those are indicators we're all looking for. And the one wild card here is, what if they have a successful lucky strike on a U.S. ship and it results in fatalities? How does that change the dynamic? Does the Trump rhetoric go softer? Do we move towards negotiations? That's all they have to do is be successful in one strike to change this whole dynamic. And that's where they have the advantage.
Well, it's the same asymmetric advantage that you have with terrorism. You have to be right 100% of the time. They
Right.
only have to be right once. So it's the same aspect here.
Exactly.
Um, I think in terms of messaging, this 21-hour marathon, it's very hard for anybody to criticize the United States that they didn't put in their best effort to bring peace to the table. That they didn't try to give every opportunity to the Iranian regime to step forward and do what's right. It's the Iranians who were intransigent in their, or recalcitrant in their negotiating. And therefore, I think it puts the United States on the high moral ground at this point. Additionally, I want to get your thoughts on why send JD Vance. Here's me thinking I'm a cynic in the way that some of these games are played. I think it's interesting that there was the Maggie Hagerman released New York Times where they disclosed that JD Vance was the only man in the room who apparently didn't want to engage in these efforts, yet he was the one that got sent to negotiate. Was this a way of demonstrating to him, as I've seen others kind of posit, look, why don't you go negotiate with the Iranians and see what you get out of it? And he got nothing.
Yeah, I think the regime thought that this was their best chance at getting concessions because of things that JD Vance had said prior to Operation Epic Fury. He was against the operation. He was against escalation. He was against foreign intervention on the behalf of Israel when it came to conducting operations against the Houthis. So they thought they had a the best entryway into U.S. concessions. And I think the message was, hey, there are no cracks in this administration. The decision maker is Donald Trump. And I think it's a way to get the regime to ask for everything and to see what the response is going to be. Those five red lines that we put out there, those collapse the regime. If they agree to stop supporting proxies, the regime collapses. If they agree to allow the U.S. to come in and take enriched uranium and have oversight 24/7 of any nuclear related facility, the regime collapses. Any capitulation to that degree, the regime collapses. So I think it was the best tactic to send the most. I testify in terrorism cases in front of judges, and you hear about the judge's background, and you wonder if they're going to be difficult or whether they're going to be easy based on who appointed them and what their position is against state sponsors of terror, and you'll be surprised. So I think the regime thought they were getting the best judge possible to weigh on their side, and they were met with a wall, and they didn't get anything. And I think they were surprised. And like you said earlier, we found out that these negotiators aren't the ones that can actually say yes. And the IRGC has the best possible supreme leader ever, one that can't talk, one that's probably in a coma. It's their guy. He's always deferred to them on every issue, and I believe the IRGC wants to keep him in that isolation to where they get to make the decisions. But when I say the IRGC, let's look at who the IRGC is now. It's there's competition within the ranks. There's distrust in the ranks. There are opportunities to exploit those schisms, and that's something I'm sure the Mossad is working on, and I'm sure that's something that our CIA operators are working on, and not necessarily our analysts. Our analysts in the CIA, DIA, NSA tend to be more politicized than the operators and the actual people collecting the intel versus assessing it. And that's I'll leave it there for now.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the IRGC. We're gonna go to the IRGC because I want you to explain something for everybody, and then I'll follow it up with discussion of the blockade that Trump expeditiously moved forward with. Um, the IRGC has the Mosaic Doctrine, which is this decentralized command structure across 31 provincial states, I believe. So that was Khomeini's way of ensuring that the regime survived. The problem is that it's very spread out horizontally, which means you can't take it out from the top down, and it's very deep. But it also means I think we're seeing that there's no coordination. That if it's designed to survive, there can be no element of negotiation with something that's so fragmented. And as you just noted, several layers deep we're going in each one of these states. They've lost a lot of their leaders here. So wide, very shallow, with people who have no real authority or expertise here, experience. How do you foresee the United States and Israel actually winning in this scenario?
But what's interesting here is we have to look at the attacks by this disparate group of IRGC cells across the country. One group thinks Qatar betrayed them because Qatar wasn't able to stop the president from attacking Iran. So Qatar was probably the most surprised country that they were getting hit by Iran. And now we see the reports that they paid Iran upwards of $6 billion once again to stop the attacks. Now they deny it, but we know how they operate. And so there's one group inside of Iran that blames Oman, Qatar, and Turkey for what has happened, because even Turkey had two ballistic missiles launched at it from these mosaic, disparate IRGC cells. So what we're looking at is a lack of command and control. If all of us here were part of the IRGC, we'd probably be broken into 10 teams, 10 teams across the province. A lot of us won't like each other. A lot of us will feel in competition with each other. And if we're the ballistic missile cell, as soon as we launch, we get killed. If we're the drone swarm cell, as soon as we launch, we get killed. The ones that are surviving are the ones that can fire one missile at a time, one drone at a time, and displace. That's what it feels like to be a member of the IRGC right now. There are no reinforcements coming. And I'll go back to this down pilot. Think about how demoralizing that was to the IRGC to have 48 hours notice that the US was coming, to know where the pilot was in a general area, to try to move towards it, to try to mobilize a civilian population to help, and to be unsuccessful, and to lose a lot of IRGC members and besieged members. There was no support aircraft to support the IRGC members moving towards this pilot. There was no support artillery. It was basically a bunch of guys in pickup trucks moving to a location that were decimated by U.S. countermeasures, whether it be drone strikes or airstrikes. So that's the reality there. So how does the U.S. deal with this? How does Israel deal with this? You got to make these cells distrust each other. When we had the ceasefire, there were still attacks. So the message hadn't gotten down to these cells to stop the attacks. And if they had, they said, we're not going to stop the attacks. We disagree with this. We're at war with the US. We're not going to stop and allow the US to win. So here's the one thing. You mentioned experts on Twitter, right? The regime is kicking ass on social media, but losing on the ground. But the IRGC member on the ground knows that they're losing. So when they hear these messages coming from the regime, they're not saying, we won, we stopped the great Satan, or we stopped the US and Israel. They're saying, we're getting our butts kicked, and now you're telling us to stop? What are you giving up? So that's where you exploit. Those are the schisms that our intel communities need to look at. And I speak to people that talk to people inside of Iran, and they're complaining that the drone strikes against the Basij and IRGC checkpoints have stopped. That they're not no longer, remember, like about 2 weeks ago,
Mhm.
Iranian citizens could give actionable intelligence to Israeli drone operators to strike besieged locations and IRGC locations. Very demoralizing. Well, apparently that stopped and the Iranian people want it back. And what I said is, listen, we need to see a sign from the Iranian people that there's a movement we can get behind here. We're not going to force an opposition movement for regime change. We're not very good at that, based on my 5 years in Iraq and my time in Afghanistan, and of course, looking at this problem set uh, as a civilian think tank member, going out to Syria, going to Iraq, going to Kurdistan, talking to the Iranian opposition, the diaspora here in DC, and also the Iranian Kurdish opposition in northern Iraq and they cross over from northern Iran. And we don't see an opposition that we can get behind. Maybe the Mossad does. So it's that kind of war right now. The regime has never been weaker than it is right now. Just like ISIS, right? This is a lot like ISIS when they spread across Iraq and Syria. They had five intelligence services initially, four of them looking outward, one of them looking inward at threats. Right? And then once we started having wins, those four intelligence directorates that were looking outwards at threats started looking internally at threats because of the divisions, because of the competition. That's what's going on right now inside of Iran. It's going into the political leadership and it's going on within the IRGC. And those are the opportunities to exploit. The team that came back from Islamabad will be viewed as failures by the hardliners in the IRGC. And I don't call the team that went to Islamabad moderates by any stretch. Ghalibaf threw people off of buildings during some of the protests during the Green Revolution. The guy came from the IRGC. There are no moderates in this country. That is a term that allows our diplomats to say we should engage the regime
Mhm.
and have a long-term change strategy.
So, what does dissolution of the IRGC ranks start to look like? I guess another way to ask it is what percentage are true believers? And of those who are not true believers, if you are a third level, fourth level, fifth level down IRGC, what's convincing you to stay, and what persuades you to leave?
Well, there's the threat of, this is a vetted organization, the IRGC. Only the best go into it. They get the best training, the best uniforms, the best paycheck, but they have families, right? But their families are also uh, leverage for the regime. If they start to question or don't show up to work, then the regime can put pressure on their families. We're looking for charismatic senior officer to break ranks, but there's no one to break ranks to, right? There's no one to join on the ground
Right.
that's US and Israel. So absent that ability to engage with somebody on the ground that will protect you, that will provide you what you need, that will give you leverage with your men as you ask them to break ranks. We don't have that in place right now. There's a media blackout inside of the country, so we can't really get reports about defections, but there's no one to defect to. That's one of the issues. So that's something that we should put in place. I know the president said that we tried to arm the protesters through the Kurds in northern Iran. Uh, I think Israel would be better at that. Let's let Israel do that. Let's see what kind of opposition we can form. Let's let the Israeli relationship with the Kurds in northern Iraq on the KDP side develop that opposition. and let's see, if the Kurds can develop a stronghold, not move out of that stronghold, but can develop a base of operations to provide logistics support, arms, then that could work. That could be a place for an IRGC colonel, general to defect to. And that may happen, but it's not going to happen if the operation doesn't continue. That's one of the things. If the operation stops, then the likelihood of that happening lessens because there's no one to go to. Now, it may develop organically, but I just don't think we have the eyes and ears on the ground to be able to capitalize on that, to exploit that.
Well, that leads to the blockade. So the operation, and I don't know when you say operation if you mean the military operation, but this is
The
certainly an
military
element of
operation.
military operation. The blockade, I mean, it's going to impose, from what I've seen, roughly $435 million a day in
Right.
combined economic damage. And from what I also read, they have oil storage capabilities, but they're only going to last 13 days. And once those oil reservoirs start to go dry or get too low, apparently there's water seepage, which then creates permanent damage to these reservoirs, which would inflict almost, I mean, just talking billions and billions of dollars of damage forever to Iran. Talk about where you think this, why didn't they implement this before? It seems to be, it would have been a good idea to try to implement it before. And if they're implementing it now, how will that change, do you think, the calculations internally for the IRGC? And let's talk about the Artesh too, the regular military and the average Iranian.
Right. So why did it happen now? I think it happened now because we were moving assets into the region to be able to do this, meaning the blockade. The ceasefire, in a cunning way, like we talked about earlier, could have been more about repositioning and strengthening the U.S. position in the region by bringing in follow-on forces. I'm a former member of the 82nd Airborne Division. I know what that unit can do. It can go anywhere inside of Iran, and it forces Iran to prepare for that. And after this rescue mission with this pilot, we demonstrated that we don't need to seize an airfield. We don't need to seize an airport. We can just seize flat terrain and be able to land in it and move from there. So the deployment of those forces is probably why we're doing it now. But I think the reason it started while negotiations were going on is that that negotiating team was almost captive. They're talking to U.S. officials while the U.S. Navy is moving into the Strait of Hormuz to begin the mine clearing operations. And I think that was a calculation where if we attack these, and we've seen what the U.S. and the IDF have done to our higher level leadership already in decimating them. And I think there was a captive element here.
Um, I'm going to open it up to questions in just a moment. So I want to remind everybody, please send your questions if you have them into the chat, and we will, start asking questions in just a moment. It also, I think, gave time, if reports are accurate, to allow these super tankers to start filling up with American oil. And what's
Right.
interesting is now America apparently has become the pivot for oil supply globally. Um, what I would imagine that was part of the rope-a-dope. This seems almost like a rope-a-dope.
It's beautiful in a way, right? Um, there's a couple things. I don't know. I'll share it with the group later in a tweet. But you know, if you look at the movement of U.S. military aircraft moving into the region and the number of tankers moving towards the United States, and also with Saudi Arabia apparently opening their east-west pipeline to be able to move that to the Red Sea and then through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, that's a huge takeaway for the regime, meaning we're no longer going to be able to do these chokeholds both in the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, the Gulf of Aden, with the Houthis, because these are bypass mechanisms being set up to take away that leverage from the regime. And so I think in that regard, it is brilliant. We have to remember if this was just a U.S. only issue, the Strait of Hormuz is not important to us. 80% of that oil goes to Asia, goes the majority of Iranian oil goes to China. And so this is an opportunity to get China to exert pressure on the regime. China has bankrolled this economy since the JCPOA, and it has not been a good return on investment for the Chinese when it comes to Iran. And so this is smart. If Iran was able to control the Strait of Hormuz for 1 year, they would probably make about $100 billion in taxes, just taxing those vessels as they come in and out.
Mhm.
In addition to what you mentioned before, that the U.S. is going to take away if this blockade stays in place. And with regard to what you educated us all on, Mark, with the 13-day lifespan of the oil reserves, um, that forces the regime to bring something to the table before the 22nd of April. And at this point, any concession on any one of those five red lines, and the president saying I'm asking for all five, would result in regime collapse. So that's where we are. They're probably not likely going to do it. We have to see whether or not the U.S. can withstand the pressure from allies and the pressure on consumers in the U.S. at the gas tanks, and of course that wild card event if the Iranians got lucky, to see this through. Otherwise, the regime will rebuild, and we'll be dealing with this problem. And in the next presidency, they'll probably ignore it if it goes to a Democrat. And if it goes to a Republican that's not like Trump, they'll probably grow again. So this is the time to do it, right? Democracies cannot win forever wars, but they can do great things within 1 to 2 years when a president has political capital.
There are a lot of questions that we could raise based on what you just said. I'm hoping, because I want others to ask some questions, that there are participants on here who will ask about MBS, will ask about Saudi Arabia's purported announcement or agreement with Trump. These are all things I'd love to get into, but I'm going to pivot to the north. Do you happen to know Seth Frantzman or know of him?
Yes, yes, I've
Yeah,
met him several times. Yep.
he tends to be a little contrarian, I would say, in some of his positions. And he wrote an interesting article talking about al Shara, urging Israel to change its policies and its positions in how to deal with al Shara, figure out how to embrace some relationship with Syria, certainly forestall or at this point, I would say foreclose on Iran's entry into to Syria. And there's opportunities in other areas as well. I remember you and I talking about it. You're not a fan of al Shara. Has anything changed? And where do
A-
you stand on Israel?
Absolutely
Changing.
not. We have to remember who Jelani is. Al-Shara is a nice way to say this guy used to be an Al-Qaeda leader. I have to be a skeptic. Somebody has to be a skeptic. And I think you curry favor with the Trump administration if you put out a positive Al-Shara piece. I'm not saying Seth's doing that, but I know Americans here in U.S. think tanks that have taken a pro-Erdogan position, a pro-Qatar
Mhm.
position, and by default, a pro-Al-Shara position, a pro-Jelani position. We have to remember we didn't trade an Iranian satellite country and a leader like Assad to be replaced by an Al Qaeda leader. You should be against both. And if Al Shara is who he says he is, he'd be dead by now. There's no way you survive that if you've actually changed who you are. And we've cultivated this protection for Al Shara by saying, well, ISIS is trying to kill him. Sure, ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra were at odds with each other. Um, because Baghdadi used to be Jelani's boss. Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. Jelani was one of his guys. He sent him to Syria, and when Baghdadi told Jelani to join or surrender his territory in Syria to ISIS, Jelani said no. And Baghdadi took Iraq, and they started fighting. Erdogan picked a position. He picked ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra ahead of the Kurds in Kobani, the YPG Kurds. So I'm a skeptic because somebody has to be a skeptic. I've been across from reconciled terrorist leaders inside of Iraq, Qais Khazali of Asab al-Haq, Doc Duke of Lebanese Hezbollah, and Qais Khazali would come across as a reformed, somebody you can reconcile with. And then he went straight back to the insurgency once he was released and started killing Americans again. With Doc Duke, he never lied about who he was. He said, if I had the chance, I'd kill every one of you in this room. Doc Duke from Lebanese Hezbollah. We have to remember who Jelani was a year ago. He was an Al Qaeda leader. They learned a lesson from the Obama administration that if you wanted to not be a target of U.S. airstrikes, you needed to change your organization, change the name of your organization to something that hasn't been designated yet as a foreign terrorist organization. We saw the rebranding of militias in Iraq, where it's not Kitab Hezbollah, a designated terrorist organization that's responsible. It's this new group that conducted the attack, but it's Kitab Hezbollah. So they learned this tactic that unless you are designated an FTO, the U.S. will not hit you. That's what Jolani did. Jolani changed the name of Jabal al-Nusra to Harir Tariq al-Sham,
Mhm.
HTS. And now he's taking the Hamas playbook. He's dressing like you, Mark, and it appeals to Westerners, right? Shave your beard a little bit, wear a sports coat, bust out the Hamas playbook, have Erdogan be your strong arm, and have Qatar finance what you're doing. I am a skeptic. Somebody has to be a skeptic.
All right, let's move over a little west and talk about Lebanon. Some interesting things taking place in Lebanon. Aoun, the president, Joseph Aoun, has been seemingly very outwardly anti-Hezbollah, as has been many Lebanese right now. You've seen reports, videos of the Lebanese people physically assaulting Hezbollah. Hezbollah is really, I think, 100 Hezbollah militants were just killed by Israel in a stronghold there. Where do you see that going, the relationship between Lebanese people and Israel, and as well the conduct of the war, IDF against Hezbollah?
This is the weakest Hezbollah's benefactor has ever been in the regime in Iran. They're not seeing the ability of the regime to protect Hezbollah. That's why they try to make it part of this ceasefire agreement. When it comes to Lebanon, one of the biggest complaints that people like me have had is that, you cannot build these institutions to counter Iran inside of Iraq and Lebanon when Iran is able to co-opt these organizations, meaning the Lebanese armed forces. Co-opt, not take over, but co-opt and make it submissive to what Hezbollah's trying to do. This is the first time the LAF has they still haven't engaged Hezbollah. They haven't engaged Hezbollah. They haven't done anything to counter Hezbollah. Most of it is rhetoric, but this is the moment that Lebanese armed forces supporters have been waiting for. When the regime is weak and when Lebanese Hezbollah is weak, they have said for decades that this is when they will do something. And we're still waiting for that. So when we hear that Israel's negotiating with Lebanon, it's negotiating with the government and the Lebanese armed forces. It's not negotiating with Lebanese Hezbollah, but it's trying to strengthen the government to know that you have an ally in this. This is a common enemy, enemy of the Lebanese people and Lebanese Hezbollah, and an enemy of the U.S., the enemy of Sunni regional allies in the area, and the enemy of Israel, of course. I don't see Lebanese Hezbollah too worried about the Lebanese government or the Lebanese armed forces, but that justifies what Israel's doing inside of Lebanon. And I know this story about what Erdogan said. I know it's from 2024, but I still think what he said in 2024 matters. He said it after October 7th. He said it when Israel was conducting strikes against Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. Erdogan said that, we could do what we did to you, just like we did in Syria and Libya. And I know now the Turkey is trying to walk back these comments that were put out there based on these 2024 comments, and that Israel has responded to. But all of this ties together. You have a NATO ally in Erdogan taking the position of the regime in Iran, taking a position where he's supporting an Al-Qaeda leader in Syria, and telling Israel that you shouldn't be attacking Hezbollah because you're going to mess up the ceasefire. And that is something that I think President Trump and NATO should address. But we've seen, feckless leadership from NATO outside of the NATO secretary to address these issues. And it's we're going to have to reevaluate some allies after this operation with the regime. We can't use these bases in the region because they're just simply targets, and we emptied them so there wouldn't be U.S. casualties. And we're seeing what the new NATO looks like, Romania and other countries. And we're seeing what our Sunni regional allies are willing to do that NATO isn't. So we have to evaluate some of these relationships. This is no way me saying that we should leave NATO, but it's we need to make sure that NATO understands that without the US, NATO is not as strong, not as cohesive, not as capable to deal with emerging threats. But we tend to politicize everything at this point.
Yeah, we do. Unfortunately, it is the name. It is the reality of these days that everything is politicized, and unfortunately, it detracts from our efforts to really address our shared adversaries. What's interesting, I think, is, and we still don't know where this is all going, um, but I'm going to use sort of the left's language to describe Iran. Right now, people don't quite understand. Iran has colonized many Arab countries. The Arab countries want Iran out. They've colonized not only by way of just people in their in the political systems, but the militaries. Hezbollah in one, the Houthis in Yemen, 30. You probably know 30 militias in Iraq. These are
Right.
Arab countries that want Iran out, and the only two countries, as it stands today, who are fighting to protect Arab countries are the U.S. and Israel. How this plays out in the future is going to be really quite interesting. But as someone did ask, I'll ask in a moment about MBS. That's a really interesting sign to come. UAE, obviously, Lebanon. I mean, these are countries that are reassessing their future alliances, and Israel seems to be right there in the middle of it. I want to get to some questions. First is from John. He wants to know what are the best strategies for the intelligence community to sow discord, create mistrust, and create internal disintegration within the IRGC?
What he just said is exactly what the intel community should be doing. All of those things. It's identifying key people. It's arming uh, key groups. Whether you're doing it or not, you say you are. You drop pamphlets. You put out information that we're working with this leader if we're not working with them, and we want the regime to turn against that person. There are so many things that we should do. We should also try to win wars, and we don't do that anymore. We should arm an opposition. That's taboo, right? Any conversation about doing what you're supposed to do to win becomes a third rail conversation in Washington D.C. where I'm at. Uh, what would I do? So what would 10 men do that could speak the language, that were willing to go inside of Iran, that had unlimited support from the U.S. government in a covert, clandestine way? We would identify the talent. We would secure the talent. We would ask the talent to look at the problem through their eyes and start building solutions based on how they think we should go. There was a phrase I used in Arabic all the time in Iraq is lazim shuf kul mashaqqa min ayunkum. We have to look at all the problems through your eyes. And as soon as you said that, they knew that you got it. That we're here to help you succeed. So that's the kind of mission, right? And this is a textbook special ops mission. You know, 10 Americans, highly trained, make 500 Iranians more powerful. They build that force. There are a lot of things that we can do. When I say a lot of things, there are simple things. There are little things that we can do that will have great consequences if we have that team that I described. You got to be able to speak the language. You have to be able to work with bad people. That's something that we've gotten away from also. You've got to work in that gray area of intel. You cannot build a force of anti-regime killers without engaging killers without engaging former regime elements. We built the Sons of Iraq in Iraq by getting tribes that work with Al Qaeda to turn against them. These tribes had blood on their hands. They'd killed Americans, but they hated Al Qaeda more. We basically reconciled with them. We empowered them to decimate Al Qaeda, and they helped us do that during the surge. They were called the Sons of Iraq. The Obama administration did not want to do that in Syria. They said they would only build a force with people who didn't have blood on their hands. So they got farmers, teachers, and dads to go to this training in Turkey. And when they went right back into Syria, they were targeted and killed and had their equipment and weapons taken away from them by ISIS because you have to work with bad people. So we would have to find somebody who had blood on their hands, whether it's unfortunately killing Iranians during protest or killing Americans in Iraq and Syria, to turn, to say, okay, I get it. That's what al-Shara, remember, what I'm saying right now is who al-Shara is. He was at Buqa in Iraq for killing Americans when he was part of Al-Qaeda. He was part of a campaign in Syria that killed our Kurdish allies in the YPG and the Syrian Defense Forces. So when I say this, it's not outlandish. We've done this before. We've dealt with people, but like I said, the people that reconcile will be targeted and will likely not survive. That's why al-Shara is different because he's not being threatened by his own guys, which means they don't believe him. Uh, those types of things. We could go in. We could have an hour, talking just about those types of operations, but we have to do the hard things right. And we don't normally do that, unfortunately. We don't do difficult and we do easy wrong too often.
Well, the way you're describing this reminds me of something your former boss, H.R. McMaster, wrote about strategic empathy, and the importance of understanding who your enemies or adversaries or your allies are. Let's see. Marin has a question. Erdogan seemed, well, these two, Mindy and Marin, are asking similar questions. So Erdogan seems to be getting more aggressive against Israel. Any concerns, and you sort of addressed this, is aligning more with the IRGC to protect the regime from collapse? And Mindy wants to know, could you discuss the magnitude of Turkey's influence and threats to Israel in view of the fact that Turkey is trying to build a ring of fire around Israel?
Right. I'm very concerned about Turkey under Erdogan's leadership. I've been concerned about him for a decade. And I was at odds with some of my Hudson Institute colleagues on Erdogan. Um, what Erdogan has done in Syria, working with Putin to secure territory, you have allies when you're going against, you know, Iranian proxies, but that's not what Erdogan did in Syria. That's not what Putin did in Syria. They worked with those groups and they targeted U.S. allies like the Syrian Defense Forces. But Erdogan will say they're all PKK, right? They're all terrorists. They're tied to our domestic terrorist threat in the PKK inside of Turkey. But we know with dictators that anyone who's Kurdish is a collaborator for the PKK. Therefore, anyone can be targeted, imprisoned, or killed. And we started seeing that in northern Syria. When it comes to Israel, I don't know how somebody who's pro-Israel, anti-Iran, can be pro-Erdogan. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I see that too often in DC. If your think tank receives Qatari money, or some of your fellows receive Qatari money, they're silent on what Erdogan is saying about Israel. They're silent on what Qatar is doing to finance, these groups or act as a pass-through for IRGC money to its proxies. And that in itself is, helps our adversaries, right? You have a concerted effort by Turkey to say that what Erdogan said in 2024 was taken out of context. It wasn't taken out of context. What they're trying to say now is because it happened in 2024, it doesn't matter. And what he said was, we can invade Israel. We're willing to invade Israel. And of course, with all of that coming out again and that video resurfacing, we saw what Prime Minister Netanyahu has said in regards to those 66 Israeli officials that were put on a memo by Erdogan and sent to the ICC. Uh, you know, it's if you're looking at networks, you have Erdogan being the strong man, you have Qatar being the financier for a Jelani Hamas relationship to target Israel. And in Erdogan's attempt to get Israel to stop striking Hezbollah, you see that they're assuaging, Hezbollah in this effort, or maybe working together in this effort based on Erdogan's position on the regime. And the unwillingness to respond to regime ballistic missile strikes. If you're looking at networks, you have a state sponsor, you have a strongman, and you have designated terrorist organizations that are becoming a different threat to Israel. Some key players still on the Iranian Shia axis, and then now you have these new players where, you know, Al-Shara Jolani will say, "Hey, I'm reformed," but his guys wearing ISIS flags are saying Israel's next. We're ready to go to Israel. We're ready to fight with Hamas. So this is different. We basically exchanged the green axis, the Iran's axis, for uh, a the infrastructure being built for Erdogan's access to threaten the Levant and to threaten Israel. And that should be very concerning because Erdogan could be easily punished if we had the backbone, sanctions, disfavor, disqualification from NATO, disqualification from, what's the other organization he wants to be part of inside of Europe? I can't think of it right now.
EU?
Yeah,
What's
no,
part?
the
There's
power
part of
group.
NATO.
Yeah, I forget what
I'm
it's
not sure.
called. But yeah, there's a lot of things we can do if we had the backbone. Like I said, we don't tend to have the backbone or the duration to do these things. But everything you're seeing now is forecasting future conflict. Everything you're seeing now is infrastructure being put in place for future conflict. So deal with it now. Take the indicators away. Take the stepping stones away. Start dismantling the infrastructure because if the next president doesn't want to deal with any of this, then we're just going to see more escalation. It's temporary solutions for the permanent ramifications of failure, right? 20 years in Iraq, we give it to Iran on the silver platter. 20 years in Afghanistan, we give it back to the Taliban. Now it's a terrorist training group. And now with the regime, this is the weakest they've ever been for 47 years. And the only way it survives is if it gets a lifeline from the United States government.
Unfortunately, Europe, NATO never envisioned having to remove a member, and therefore it doesn't have a mechanism for removing Turkey. So that is a challenge for NATO. We have a few more questions. Before I get to them, and I think we'll probably have room for just one more. So if I can't get to everybody else's, I apologize. Hopefully this conversation was robust enough. And if you have that question and want to email it to us, by all means, we'll try to get the answer to you. I want to offer some words on behalf of ELNET. As many of you know, ELNET works to broaden and deepen diplomatic, defense and security, and economic cooperation between Europe and Israel. We've had incredible success, and that success must continue. If Ukraine comes online, and we think it will, if Hungary comes online, and we think it will, there are so many more opportunities for ELNET to expand its opportunity sets. You have been, those of you who support ELNET, are the backbone of this organization. We thank you for all that you do. If you've not yet renewed for 2026, please do so. You can do so on our website. You can contact one of the directors. We need your support. The opportunity is there to be had. The future looks bright, and I think we stand at the juncture of many opportunities between European countries and Israel. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your support. All right, let's end with this question. Finally, Carol wrote it in about MBS. Now, if the reporting is accurate, MBS promised $100 billion in funding for the American venture going forward, military campaign going forward, $1 trillion in U.S. domestic investments, which I think had already been discussed previously, normalization with Israel, conditioned on the defeat of Iran, and a Saudi-Israel energy corridor. And I think that is very similar to IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. Saudis have been the impediment there, but Israel and Saudis can make that a reality. You want to weigh in on that? Because I think it's a great way to end this conversation on what seems to be an optimistic note.
Mohammed bin Salman is out Qataring Qatar, but in a good way. Provide this money to the United States, secure this relationship with Israel, and let's contrast that with Qatar. Qatar's not being asked to be part of the Abraham Accords because if it did, it would collapse. The royal family would collapse. It's a Muslim Brotherhood entity. It can't do it. But Saudi Arabia, a country that's against the Muslim Brotherhood, has now seen that Israel and the United States are taking down its biggest competitors here. When it comes to Iran, when it comes to Qatar in a way, by sidelining it, we're really going to evaluate this relationship afterwards. But this is what you want Saudi to be. This is what we wanted Mohammed bin Salman to be. The Abraham Accords, apparently the regime thought that if they launched October 7th, that would derail that. It strengthened it because Israel since then has taken on U.S. enemies in Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, all designated by the United States as foreign terrorist organizations. And the U.S. and Israel have demonstrated the ability to take down the regime and make it weaker than it's ever been. So this is the right time for Mohammed bin Salman to do this, MBS. And I think the president needs to hold him to this because that sidelines Qatar. And that is huge because Qatar, if the regime goes away, the next state sponsor of terror spotlight is going to go on Doha. There's no other country it can go on. It has all the funds. It does these things. It spends more money to protect its reputation than any other country, and it spends more money on terrorism than any other country. So I think this is a great message. I need the administration to make sure this happens and let's get this in place. But I think it's solid. We have to remember what the Saudi defense minister said to the president behind closed doors, to Rubio as well. You have to attack the regime right now. We may be saying that you shouldn't do it, with Erdogan and Qatar initially when MBS was saying we're against this. But now that they've seen what the United States can do, they were shocked that the supreme leader is no longer there. They were shocked at the level of decapitation that took place in the first 3 days of Operation Epic Fury and Roaring Lion. So this is a chance to get in on the winning team early and solidify your position, and that's what's happening.
All right. Well, that's, I think, an optimistic note to end on. We
I
will
don't
watch
do hope.
closely.
I don't do hope,
This,
Mark. I
no, no.
don't do hope.
Hope and optimism, I think, are different. Everybody wants to define them differently. I think optimism is based on sort of facts and conditions. You have reason to be optimistic. Hope is just faith. This is not about faith. The
Right.
conditions seem to be adjusting in a certain way that we should be optimistic based on the trends that we're seeing. That a future could be more, uh, could be brighter. Just
Yeah,
put it that way.
it's opportunistic for our allies in the region that have now seen the difference between Israel and Iran. Iran attacked all of those Gulf allies.
Right.
Israel did not, and that's going to have a lasting impact. So opportunistic. Hope is for your family, your friends, and your football team, not for an adversary.
Okay. On that note,
Mark,
Mike.
Mark, I just want to say thank you
Oh, hey,
for
Tom.
doing a great job, and we appreciate our guest today. But an important thing, I too am optimistic about what's happening and the new world order. Hopefully, that will result after all this is done. And through it all, ELNET has been steadfast and has been committed, and we are gaining support. When people who were criticizing Europe, we're seeing how slowly they're coming back because that's the hope and opportunity. So thank you, everybody, for joining in today.
ELNET Chair Tom Flesch, thank you very much for jumping in.
Thanks for
I
having me,
thought you were
Tom.
not able to do it, but I'm glad you jumped in.
Thank you so much.
Everybody, have a great day. Mike, as always, this was terrific. I think everybody really appreciated your thoughts and commentary on what's going on right now. And we'll watch with eagerness how it all plays out.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me on that.
Bye,
Appreciate
everybody.
it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.